How can we really get to know who the ancient Romans were? Although, when we think about ancient Rome, we tend to think about powerful and significant leaders of the Roman Empire, such as Julius Caesar, thinking about these leaders doesn't really give us a good sense or overview of Roman life as a whole. Instead, we must look at the daily lives of the typical inhabitants of the Roman Empire. To understand them better, we can take a look at their buildings, their hygiene, and their food. First, their buildings. Taking a look at their buildings and the functions of their buildings can give us an idea of the life of the people who built them. So although Americans today, we tend to think about homes as being the center of life. We do everything at our homes. We cook, we eat, we relax, and just generally spend our lives. A lot of people now even work at their homes. But in that time, it wasn't thought of in the same way. So an example of this is our homes are not particularly built to last, and they're meant to kind of look nicer, and they have more windows. Unlike many other homes in places like Europe and in places like Rome, which are built more thick and kind of bulky and more, they don't look as nice in the end, but they will last a lot longer. So what this can kind of signify is how many homes a culture might have. So for example, in America, we move very frequently as Americans, but in other places around the world and in other times, they didn't so much. And B, it also signifies the amount of time you're going to spend in your home. So as Americans, we want it to look a lot nicer because it's where we stay for most of our lives. But in that time, the Romans spent more time in the public areas. So they put lots of effort into their public square. It was very large and beautiful with elaborate structures and buildings around it. And this is where people would basically live their lives. They could hang out here, they would have elections, they would have trials, speeches, even gladiatorial matches. This is also where they'd have school, and many people would have social gatherings here. So as you can imagine, unlike in our homes where we do most things and then we go out and, maybe we go to school or we go to a social gathering, literally everything takes place in the same space with the exception of like sleeping. So their public square was built for this, and that's how we know a lot of this. Another interesting thing that shows is that in this time they didn't have any police officers. So what that meant is justice became more of a kind of a thing for groups to do rather than the government or police. So what naturally formed is kind of this system. It's called the patron system. I'm sorry, and it was kind of to keep people in check, because a lot of what police do is they just kind of, they'll hang around places to kind of, remind people that they're there and to keep them in check. Because if someone does something, there may be someone else there to stop them who's not a police officer. But what any old person can't do is kind of give this sense of like kind of this preventative measure of just being there, by just being there, like police officers can. So in that time, this was kind of lacking from their society. So what this meant is they had to keep each other in check. And a way they would do this was through the patron system. So essentially, you would like sign up for a patron group, and it would be led by a patron who's a very wealthy, very rich, very powerful person. And they would have people underneath them. And it would be somewhat like a gang or the mob, in that once you were part of this group, you had like protection. And if someone, tried to mess with you, the group would be responsible for helping you. And so the leader every day would have all the patrons over for breakfast, and then they'd kind of talk about their issues. And maybe if someone had been attacked, then they would go, get justice for that. Or if someone was being tried, then they would all go to the court building and just pester the judge, essentially. One interesting thing about this is they did not have, I'm sorry, what was I saying? So they had a more organized way of punishment as well. So if, for example, someone attacked someone else, if someone attacked their neighbor, then their neighbor would like gather up their gang to get justice. But instead of just going and attacking that person, they would go to their leader, and their leader would be responsible for punishing that person publicly. Likely this punishment would follow kind of the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth policy. So like if he beat him with a stick, he'd beat him with a stick in front of everyone just to show that justice had been done. So this too is kind of reflected in the types of houses they had. So they didn't have any windows on their houses, not outwardly at least. They had inward windows. So this kind of reflects kind of protection from the type of mob justice that they were operating under. And also the larger houses that they had, called domus. These are their personal homes. These would likely be the homes of the patrons. They actually had areas for people to gather. So they would have kind of like a large living room type thing. They would actually have a hole in the ceiling and a little thing to collect rainwater in. But it's a big empty space around that for people to gather. And there would be a little spot for the patron to stand, and some area behind him for maybe the more influential people in the group. And this would be where they would have their morning meetings, and where the patron would serve them breakfast, and they'd talk about things. And so this is also reflected in the house design, as I just explained. This system was a big part of their everyday lives. The average person, however, would live in houses called insula, which are very similar to apartments. And they were just, kind of big buildings, and on the floor, each family would have a chunk of the floor. You get like a few rooms, and that's where they live. There were lots of fast food places there, so like if you went down to the bottom floor, they'd have like a lot of stalls like facing outward into the streets, like on the outside of the building. So that was where like the average person would live. The middle class citizen would be living there. Another thing that could tell us a lot about their life would be their roads. So they built very strong roads for traveling, mainly for the army to travel. They actually had road signs, they were more like mile markers, and they were very large pillars. And so you could use it to kind of keep track of how far you had traveled. They built very complex roads that were made out of stone, and they had many layers to them, and they actually angled inward as they went underground for more structure, and they have actually lasted for thousands of years. They were very complicated to build, so it shows they cared a lot about being able to travel well, particularly, as I said before, for their military. Another interesting thing is they actually buried their dead beside roads, which is something, we don't really do. And instead of on the tombstone having a little word about the person who died, it would kind of have that, but it would be like the person were talking to you. So they, you might walk down the path and see a tombstone, and it would say, "Hi, my name is Jeffrey. I died. I was a sheep farmer, and I forgot to check for wolves before I went to sleep and got eaten." Anyway, so it might tell you a little about them and how they died, perhaps. It would also, interestingly enough, for women, quite often say that they were very good with wool. So it was apparently seen as an important trait of a woman to be able to work with clothing. This effect of having the dead buried by the road kind of created an interesting effect. According to Dr. Laurel Taylor, quote, "Entering a city brought one into immediate and direct contact with the world of the dead," unquote. So that's just kind of a way to think of that. So by looking at the structure of their houses and the way they built their roads, we could see what was important to the Romans people in their everyday lives, and um, even more how they lived their everyday lives more specifically. On to point two, Roman hygiene. So the Romans had very good hygiene. One of the biggest reasons they were able to have this is because they actually brought in water from other areas. So, one of the big problems with cities is it's hard to find clean water. There's a lot of people living close together, and there could be a lot of trash and things like this, so not everything's very clean. So what they did instead is they'd pipe it from outside of town. They'd pipe it in from mountains. So they had built like these big stone structures that would carry water into the city for them to use. They also had public toilets. So the public toilets would essentially be like a bench, and they would have holes in it for people to sit and go to the bathroom. And it was also kind of an area for socialization, oddly enough. So people would often sit around here and talk, and or maybe read. That was also common for people to read. And then for wiping, they would have sticks with sponges on them that they could clean in a little gutter of water, it's thought, that would run in front of the bench. So all this water flow would be kind of a part of their sewer system. They also had, in their private homes, they would have toilets that are kind of similar. It's like a little piece of the bench. And then to flush it, you just throw water underneath. So you sit on it, and there's a little like hole in the bottom, and it's lower than the ground, so the water naturally goes down into it. You just throw the water there, and it's carried away into their sewer systems. They also cared a lot about their baths. So, interesting, we think of bathing as kind of a private or personal thing, something to be done inside your house. It's pretty practical. There's not much, it's not very intricate, but this was different. Quote, for the Romans, the baths weren't just a place to get clean, but this larger social center where a variety of activities were taking place, unquote, and that's according to Alyssa Whitmore. And so in the baths, people would do all sorts of things. They would socialize, get haircuts, they would play sports. There were even surgeries that were done at the baths, weirdly enough, because they were able to find things like tools or bits of bones or teeth in the baths. And this makes sense to a certain degree because we're used to such a high level of sanitation that we don't realize that maybe that was one of the most sanitized place they could have been to. I'm sorry, there could have been at the time. So that was where they would naturally do medical procedures. They had a very complex bathing system. They would have lots of baths with different temperatures of water. And they didn't really use soap. So it's interesting, the way they'd get clean is they'd bathe in, they'd put on olive oil, they'd put it all over their skin, and then they'd kind of scrub themselves with grit, some sort of like dirt or soil, and then they'd scrape themselves with kind of like a dull blade. This was just to kind of get rid of the grease and dirt. And after this, you do a series of like hot and then cold baths of like different temperatures, but specifically, you kind of go back and forth a little bit. And the purpose of this is to, it's supposed to be good for your skin. They would also use pumice. So the baths were kind of a place to socialize, and these large structures point to the way they lived their lives, and to the hygiene they used, which was quite advanced for this time. Something else they had was public laundry. So they had these big laundry vats, and they were run by slaves essentially, and they would have urinals in the city at like crosswalk areas and things like this. And when people would pee, it would take the water away, and it would kind of essentially cook in the sun for a little bit, and then they would use it in the laundry vats. So the pee would kind of like turn into ammonia after this time, and the slaves would step in it with the clothes in it to kind of churn it up. So although it's kind of gross, it would clean their clothes. So this was their way of cleaning things. It's a little strange to us today, but it would have been pretty technologically advanced at the time. So we could see that the Romans had great hygiene, whether it was with bathing themselves or cleaning their clothes or proper sanitational facilities, bathrooms. And although a lot of them seem a little archaic today, they definitely were not, and were much more technologically advanced at the time. On to point 3, the food they ate. So the average peasant would have eaten mostly just bread and olive oil, and most people just drank watered down wine. It's kind of a standard drink. They ate a lot in this time, a lot of fast food. So you're walking throughout the day and you can get food from little stalls that they had, and actually kind of similar to Americans who also eat a lot of fast food. They didn't struggle with food. In fact, they had a bigger problem with obesity and things like this rather than starvation. Some of the fast food they may have eaten was things like roasted meat or lasagna, something similar to lasagna or pizza. They didn't actually have welfare in that time, which is interesting. What they did instead was they would just give out free grain, and eventually later on they gave out free bread. So every year they would just go to Egypt and just buy a bunch of grain and just give it away for free. And this kind of kept people satisfied. According to Tiberius, if they stopped giving away the free bread, it would mean, quote, the utter ruin of the state, unquote. We have a story of what a Roman feast would have looked like. So someone recalls that you would have gone, and first the servants would have washed your hands using snow water that they would have melted, and then you lay down in your kind of chair around the table. Then servants would, or slaves would, sing and pluck your toes and give you pedicures, so they would give you pedicures and sing, and then when they bring out the food, they would start with perhaps a statue of a donkey, so it would be made out of bronze, and it would have a little saddlebag on the back that was full of olives that you could eat. Some other food they ate would be dormice with honey and poppy seeds. It was very common. Sausage, plums, pomegranates, things like this. Interesting thing about the dormice is this was kind of a common, today we have lots of kids who maybe mow lawns or babysit, but in that time, a way that children could make money was by raising dormice to eat. So, dormice for other people to eat. Another thing that they were served at this meal was Falernian, which was a type of wine, and it kind of demonstrates the extravagance they came to expect. It was a status symbol, and it was made from grapes that were harvested late, so they were gently frozen, and then it would be made into wine and aged for 15 to 20 years. So that's a long time. So, although when we think of Rome, we tend to think of the large figures like Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and other great rulers, these people don't really define the Roman Empire as a whole, although they had a great historical impact. Rather, to really get a sense of the empire as a whole, we need to take a look at the everyday lives of the average Roman citizens. And we can learn this by taking a look at the buildings they made, the hygiene they had, and the food they ate. Thank you. Sorry, I know this is a long one.